Okay, so we've taken the first step of getting out of the linear confines of traditional animation into becoming interactive programmers and being able to tell the timeline to stop. The next step is creating buttons so we can then tell the timeline to go to and stop a particular spot, or even to go to and play a particular spot. And that's what we're going to be doing. There's a lot of power involved there with us being able to lay all kinds of different animations and graphics and layouts and whatever across the timeline, and then being able to have buttons to just tell it to jump around and either stop or jump around and play certain spots of the timeline. That's really what doing things interactively is all about. So I'm going to close my actions panel. I don't need that for now. Before we code any buttons, we need to actually create the buttons and create the button graphics. Let me show you how that works. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to make a new layer in between my happy layer and my code layer. Remember, the code layer should always stay on top. And I'm going to name my new layer buttons. On my buttons layer now, we want to create these buttons. And we want these buttons to be on frame 1 because that's where the timeline is stuck. It's just sitting here stopped until we tell it what to do. So because it's sitting here stuck on frame 1, we want to make sure the buttons are visible on frame 1 so the user can click them so we can move on. If we had them visible somewhere over here, the user would never be able to get to them because it never plays over there. So on frame 1, on the buttons layer, I'm going to draw a button using the rectangle tool. All right, so I'm going to select the rectangle tool. And in the color and style of the rectangle tool, I don't care what color you make your buttons, but I do want you to have a fill and a stroke. And we're going to make the stroke size 5 pixels. All right, so for me, I'm going to set my stroke color. I'm going to copy my animation here, and I'm going to leave my stroke color black and take my fill color and make it the same color as my happy face here. So just make sure you have 2 separate colors, a fill color and a stroke color. Make sure your stroke size is set to 5. Again, we're just on the regular rectangle tool. And then the other thing I want to do is down here under rectangle options, I can set the corner radius. So instead of 10, instead of just a hard-edged corner rectangle, we want a nice rounded edge rectangle, which is what more modern buttons are going to look like. So I'm going to put 10 in there. So I have a 10 pixel rounded rectangle corner. All right. So once again, just 2 different colors, fill and stroke on your rectangle tool options. Make sure your stroke size is set to 5 and your rounded rectangle corners are set to 10. When we've got all that, then somewhere, now I know we're going to have 3 of these, so leave enough room for 3 of them, but we're just going to draw one at a time, so we're going to end up copying the other ones once we set the first one all up. But I'm just going to click somewhere and drag out a nice little button. Poof, there's a button. So it has the fill color, has the stroke color, and the stroke is 5 pixels, and then we have these nice rounded corners because we set the rectangle options to be rounded. All right, so draw yourself a beautiful little button shape. And now we want to make a button symbol out of this. Now, first of all, double check and make sure that you created your button on the buttons layer. Didn't accidentally put it on the code layer or accidentally put it on your character layer. You should see the little keyframe filled up on the buttons layer. You should be able to hide it, all that stuff. If you did draw it on the wrong layer, just undo it. Make sure you have that buttons layer keyframe selected and draw it there. Once you have this button rectangle, it's extremely important in this case when we create our button symbol to make sure that we select both the fill and the stroke. I did this purposely because it's very common to accidentally just click in the middle here and do convert to symbol, and ultimately that is not including the outline. And we want the outline, we want the stroke to be part of the symbol. So it's really common to accidentally do that, to just click the middle of a shape and think you have the whole shape selected, but you don't, because the fill and the stroke are separate. So to select the whole thing, once again, I can just rectangular marquee around the whole thing, or I could just click on the keyframe that I drew it on, which will also select everything on the keyframe. So you should see the little dotted pattern letting you know it's selected on both the fill and the stroke, right? So once we know that we've got it on the right layer, and we know that we have the entire rounded rectangle with the stroke selected, now we can actually create a symbol. So we create a button symbol, and we start the process in the exact same way that we start the graphic symbol process for animating, is we just click on, we either choose F8, or you can click on Convert to Symbol. Either one does the same thing, and we'll open our Convert to Symbol dialog box here. And now inside of our Convert to Symbol dialog box, there's one major change we need to make, is the type of symbol. There are 3 types of symbols in Animate: a graphic, a button, and a movie clip. We'll learn about the movie clip in due time, but for right now, we want to select a button. Make sure that you are making it a button symbol. Now we're going to give it a name. And I'm going to name mine Button 1. Okay, hit OK, and it makes a symbol. So now I can't select just part of it, it's one whole symbol. All right, if I look at my library, once I've created that, I can see that the button symbol actually has a different icon. So the graphic symbol has these 3 shapes, and then the button symbol has this little finger pushing a button. A little visual cue, let you know you did that right, made a button symbol. And now where things get interesting, well actually before we even do anything else, having created your button symbol, if I were to publish this now, look in the browser, the timeline's still just waiting. Now if I roll over my button, I can see that the cursor changes. So it goes from the arrow cursor to the little Mickey Mouse hand. All right, and that's letting me know, at least on a desktop or laptop, that the user can roll over and interact with this button, right? There's other things we can do to make that more apparent. Now you're all, I assume, familiar with the idea of a button rollover, that a lot of times you can roll over a button and you'll see its graphics change to let you know you're rolling over it. What's important to realize is that rollovers are something that exist on laptop screens and desktop screens, and a touch screen, mobile screen, there's really no such thing as a rollover because there's no mouse cursor. You just touch the screen. So for that reason, there's a different type. Besides a rollover, there's a different state we have to deal with. But I'll show you how to mess with those. First thing I want to point out is just out of the box, you end up with this button that kind of on the desktop gives you this little cursor change. Go back in here. A lot of times when you publish, you might get this output panel that pops up that gives you warnings and stuff. Don't worry about that. It's always giving you weird warnings in HTML5. It's nothing you have to worry about. I have mine connected to this timeline thing, so whenever I publish, come back to it, I kind of have to click the timeline tab again to see it. You might just see your output panel just popping up in the middle somewhere and close it. It's really not that important. It's not a big deal, at least for what we are doing. All right, so now I'm going to show you what's different about a button and the things we can do to it to give it some interactivity without even writing any code. All right, so what I want you to do is go ahead and double click now on the button to go inside of it. All right, so just like we could double click to go inside of our graphic symbols before, and inside of graphic symbols just have another timeline, inside of the button, I still see the breadcrumb trail works just the same. Up top, I can see that we came from scene 1, and now I'm inside of this symbol named button 1. But what's different is the actual timeline itself. I still have a keyframe down here, and I still would need to add frames to move along, but instead of numbers, there's these 4 button states: up, over, down, and hit. And these are just 4 different states of the button that we can change its graphics and its interactivity without writing any code. And I'll show you how that works. So even though this works a little differently than a regular timeline that just has numbers on it for animating frames, we still deal with frames and keyframes in the same way. All right, so right now we're stuck on the up state, and the up state is what the button looks like when there's no interaction and it's just up and no one's touching it or anything. That's what the button looks like that. So that's where it starts. Now I'm going to show you what each of the 4 states do, but first off, we need to just create some frames so we can actually get there. So just like we would to create more time for an animation, I'm going to go over to this hit frame, and I'm going to hit F5, or you can use insert frame. I'm not doing keyframes yet, just frames. And now that I do that, now I'm able to use my blue playhead and kind of drag it around in between the 4 button states, up, over, down, and hit. All right, so now the first thing I want to change is I want to actually make a rollover state. And to do that, to make it different than the up state, we're going to need to keyframe it. So I'm going to go ahead and keyframe my overstate. I'm going to select it, hit F6, or you can click the add to key or insert keyframe button. And now that we have 2 separate keyframes, I can now make changes between my button. Actually, I don't want to do that yet. Well, we can leave that keyframe there, that's fine, but I forgot there's something else we want to add. We want to add a label to this button. So even though we're inside of the button and it looks a little different, we can still not only add frames and keyframes, but we can also add layers. So this initial layer 1 that just has our rectangle on it, I'm just going to rename that. I'm going to name it box. All right, so we've got our box layer, and our box on it. And then I'm going to make a new layer, the new layer button right there, a little plus. And I name this layer label. And on the label layer, I'm going to take the text tool. And I'm just going to create some text. I'm going to go over to the properties panel, the text tool open. And one thing I want to make sure, and it should default this way, you shouldn't have to change it. But for right now, I'll explain the difference later on, but for right now, we want to make sure that you are on static text. What static text does, it will actually make vector shapes out of any font that you create. So it's not necessary for the end user to actually have that font or to program it in with a web font. It'll actually create vector shapes out of them, so it'll always look the same no matter what. So it doesn't matter to me what font you use or what size or anything. I'm going to make mine black. I'm going to leave it as Open Sans Condensed Bold. And I'm just going to type a label. I'm going to put my label in all caps, and I'm going to label it move. In fact, I'm not going to do Open Sans Condensed. I'm going to change this to Open Sans. Makes it a little bigger. And then I'm just going to kind of center it. Remember, when you have something selected, using the arrow keys will nudge something 1 pixel at a time, or you can use the shift arrow keys to nudge 10 pixels at a time. So it doesn't have to be perfect. You can just kind of nudge it in the middle somewhere. I'll show you how to use this align panel later. Just align it right to the center there on mine. So we have this button set up on the up state. We've got the box layer, which has the fill and the stroke. And then we've got a label layer, which has a text label. I'll give you a minute to get that text label in there, pick the font you want, get it to fit, get it centered. I'm going to hit save. It's good practice to do that intermittently. Once you've got your button set up with a label on one layer, the box on another layer. Now, if you haven't done it already, you can make a keyframe on the overstate and realize I'm only setting this keyframe on the box layer because I don't need to change my label. I'm just going to change something about the box. So what I want is I just want something subtle to change. And when I roll over, I'm going to make the outline change color. All right, so to do that, so I'm on my over state, my over frame, and I have my keyframe here, so it's going to change from whatever I have in the up state. And I want to select my entire outline, but if you do it manually, it can be kind of a pain in the sense that, you know, I can select it and it only grabs initially this line. I could hold shift and click all the way around it to get every corner and the lines. There's a faster way to do it. So I just did it manually by holding shift and clicking all the way around. But a better way would be for me just to click on this keyframe, which will select both the fill and the stroke, and just have everything selected. And then if I click it on the stage and can see the properties panel, I don't need to select just the stroke or just the fill. I can change the color of the stroke here also because I have it selected and it knows it's the outline, right? If I didn't want the fill selected, I could even use shift to click it once I've kind of region or keyframe selected everything, and I can unselect it so all that's left is the stroke. And then all I see is stroke over here, my color and style. But it's just as easy just to select all of it. Make sure you select it on the stage. Either way that you do it, just make sure that you have the full stroke selected. And I'm going to change its color. I'm going to change its color to this greenish color. So then you should be able to take your playhead inside of your button, and you should be able to see that difference as you switch between them, the up state and the overstate. You can see that little thing switch. Once you're able to do that, then you could test your movie in the browser. And now if you roll over your button, you'll see that actually change its look. All right, so without writing any code, we now have an interactive kind of user visual cue here that we're rolling over the button by changing. So anything you put in this over keyframe, no matter how many layers you have, just dragging this thing to the over state, whatever it looks like, is what it's going to look like when you roll over the button. Now, the over state is less important than the down state. I usually do both of them. But like I explained, there is no such thing as an overstate on touchscreens. And so many people are going to be looking at your stuff on touchscreens that you want to make sure, and the overstate is kind of, it's nice to have. It's nice to see that on the desktop, but just realize that that doesn't really show up if you're just pointing your finger and touching something. What does show up on both desktop and touch screens is the down state. The down state is what the button looks like when you're actually pressing down on the button. And then when you let go of the button, that's when it fires the code that's on it. That's pretty much how all buttons work. You'll press and you'll see kind of the button change state. And then when you let go, whether it's with your finger or with a mouse click or whatever, you let go, that's when the button actually fires, right? So we're gonna do the same thing. I'm going to keyframe the box again. I'm gonna leave the label the same throughout. In fact, I'm even gonna lock the label layer so I don't accidentally move it or select it or anything. And now I'm going to keyframe the down state, F6. And on the down state, now I'm gonna change my fill color to match that same border so that it just totally changes the color of the button. So now I should see these three states that I can go through, and the up state is what it is by default, the over state when the mouse rolls over it on a desktop, and then the down state when you're actually pressing down on it. It's three different click states. Now I can run it in the browser, and I can see that in action. Up state, over state, down state. So I can sit there and click my button, and I can see, sure enough, yep, looks like I clicked it. All right, and then the final state We don't actually have to do anything. In fact, we're not going to do anything in this case, but I am going to explain to you what it is and how it works in case you ever need to use it. The hit state represents the clickable area of the button. Now, most of the time, your clickable area is just going to be the button, right? In this case, you know, if I look at it in the browser, I do in fact want this entire area to act like the button, right? I'll show you a case where you might want to use it, but just to illustrate what it does, you don't necessarily have to do this part. You can just watch me, just so you understand these different button states. I do want you to have an up, over, and down state. But the hit state, because we have frames that come out here, all these graphics, basically the down state is the hit state, and these basically show that, okay, this is the area I can click the button. If I wanted to do something crazy and keyframe the hit state and maybe just slap some giant shape over here, okay, so you can see as I scroll through here, up, over, down, and then hit state. If I publish this, it's opening a new tab every time I publish, notice that the button still works the same way. I don't see that big square, but if I go over here, it actually thinks that's part of the button. So I can actually roll over or click in this whole area rather than have to click on the button itself, because the hit state is what tells us what the area of the button represents. So like I said, most of the time, your button itself is going to handle that. But a couple of instances where this can come in useful. Number one, if your button is small and you find that people's fingers are having a hard time touching it, I'm undoing to get rid of that, on a small phone or something, you might want to make the hit state a little larger than the button so people don't have to actually click right on the pixels of your button, but can kind of click anywhere in the area. That's really common for mobile phone development, to make these larger hit states so things are a little easier to touch. Another one that I see more commonly in this class is, let me show you, if I were to remove, this fill, for example, and it was just text with an outline. Let me show you this. Text doesn't actually, like I would have to click on the actual font, like on part of one of the letters for the button to fire, or on the outside of it. But I couldn't here, it's a little confusing because I have it yellow in the middle on this one. So let me get rid of it there also. So now I just have an outline with text inside of it. And if I run that, anywhere but the outline or the actual text, like if I click in this white area, the button doesn't work, right? And that's no good for a user. Like, we don't want them to have to actually click on the line or actually click on the letter. So I could, in theory, use the hit state to just draw a box around this. Now the hit state is never going to show up, so you can just put whatever you want on there. So I can just drag that box around it. I even did it a little bigger than the button. And now if I test it, now that whole area works, right? Does that make sense? Because I'll see a lot of times students use just text as a button, which is okay to do. But if you use just text as a button, you have to be very careful to make sure and put some kind of solid shape hit state around it, so you're not forcing the users to click like right directly on one of the letters. All right, so I'm going to go back now. And I'm going to undo back to before that little hit state thing and undo back to where I have my fills in there. All right, so I'm good to go. I have no hit state. Testing my movie, and sure enough, whoop, undo a little further, get my other middle back, there we go. Okay, so now I should be able to roll over, click down, all my button stuff going on. All right, easy enough, right? We haven't had to write any code to make that button work. All we did is we just made a button symbol. And once we made a button symbol and went inside of it, Now we can make different layers and put keyframes on those layers to organize the graphics however we want. The important thing to realize is that this up, over, and down state, and even sometimes the hit state, how those function. All right. So now unlock my label layer, go back up to scene 1, and I'm going to save my file. It's very important. We did a lot of stuff. I don't want to lose any of that. I saved it. Now, the next step is we want 3 of these buttons. We want a move button, a rotate or a flip button, and a shrink button to match our frame labels, because this is what we're going to click each of these buttons to play each of these animations eventually. But we want all of these buttons to look the same. You know, we just basically need the label to change. So we don't want to have to draw them all and do all of those steps again 2 more times and somehow get it pixel perfect. What we can do is we can copy this button and then make a duplicate of it so we can change it. And I'll show you what I mean. This is another major stepping stone when it comes to working with symbols inside of this program, is being able to use a symbol as kind of a template for another symbol. I'll show you what I mean. So we've got your button here. And what I want to do is I just want to get 2 more versions of it on the screen. So I could copy and paste. I could select this, copy, paste, paste. Could do it that way. Or I could even go into the library where my button lives and I could just drag 2 more versions of it out of the library. All right? It doesn't have to be perfect. Notice it tries to kind of line things up for you. All right, so I want to end up with 3 copies of the same button. All right, and right now, if I were to test it in my browser, all 3 buttons show up. They've all got their overstate and their downstate. I'll click them and all that good stuff. All right. But the key now here is that I don't want them all to say move, right? I want to change the labels, but there's an issue here, is we can't just go in and change the label on the second button because it's an instance or a copy of this button symbol. So if I were to go in, doesn't matter which one of these 3 I were to go in, but if I choose this middle one, if I were to double click and go inside of it, and if I were to change the label text, say flip, all right, it looks like it's great until even before I go back out of the symbol, I can see, whoops, that changed all of them, right? That's not what we want at all. This is, once I go in to edit this symbol, I'm editing all of them because it's a copy of all of them. So I'm going to undo, back to where it says move, back to my main thing. So here's the key. The key is there's a lot of situations where you'll have a button or a symbol or even an entire layout, an entire page that you have set up as a symbol, and you want to make a copy of it, but you want that copy to be a little bit different. You just want to use the first one as kind of like a starting point, as a template. And it's a very, very easy command to do that. What we do is you right-click over one of these. So I'm going to right-click over this middle button, and about 2/3 of the way down the right-click menu, there is duplicate symbol. That is the key. Right? So duplicate symbol. Click on duplicate symbol, and that will open this little duplicate symbol dialog box that all it does is give you the symbol name and then the word copy. And I'm going to rename it, instead of button 1 copy, I'm going to rename this button 2. Hit OK. And now I see that I have a separate button in my library. That's key. Is it now use button 1 as kind of a template to create button 2. And now button 2, even though it looks the exact same, it's now a separate object. So I can actually go inside of it and notice up here that it says button 2. So if I were to go inside of button 1, scene, button 1. I'll go to inside button 2, scene, button 2. Now that it's a different symbol, even though it started with this button 1 as a template, now I can go ahead and change my label and it's only going to affect button 2. So button 1 still says move, and button 2 says flip. All right? So then I'm going to do the exact same thing on this third button. Once again, I have to remember to duplicate it first. If I just go inside of this and start to change things, it's going to change the first one and the last one, because right now they're both instances of button 1 from the timeline or from the library. But to change that, I can duplicate the symbol. So actually, there's also, I believe, is it one of these? Convert, edit, swap, break apart. No, I guess they don't have a button for duplicate symbol. That surprises me, actually. Well, regardless, right click and choose duplicate symbol. I'm going to name this one button 3. Look at my library. I've got move, button 1, flip, button 2. The button 3 still says move, but it is a separate symbol now. So now I'm able to double click, go inside of it, and change this label. I'm going to change this label to say shrink. You may need to nudge it back into the center or whatever each time. I'm going to go up to my main scene. I'm going to hit save. And you can see now that very quickly, without having to recreate these boxes and all of these button states and all of that stuff that we did for the first one, very quickly, I was able to just copy that button, duplicate it, change the label, and now all of a sudden I've got 3 separate buttons that all look and work exactly the same, with the exception of the label that's on. All right, so when you get there, I want you to save your project, save your file. Well, so today, quick review. The new concepts, we created a symbol and we made 3 animations, all right? There was a couple new concepts involved here. One of them was actually copying sets of keyframes and tweens. So we would make a selection, then we would hold Alt to drag it around and make copies. So it was a little quicker to set up these other 2 animations and keep all their properties. And then we use these frame labels to give ourselves a spot on the timeline to actually kind of label and make the buttons know where to go. We'll get to that next week, and I'll show you how we actually connect to those and tell the timeline to do that. We wrote our first piece of JavaScript on our code layer in our actions panel, say this.stop. And then besides the copying keyframes, the writing that this.stop JavaScript command to stop the timeline, making our frame labels, we also made a new type of symbol, a button symbol, gave it an over and down state, even taught you what the hit state does. And then we used duplicate symbol to create copies of the symbols that we could then edit, but still keep all the hard work that we did to set up the first one.